Hello, and welcome back to the next video in this training series to unlock your crypto journey. This series is meant for the newbie coming into the cryptocurrency space. And in today's video, I'm going to be joined by BC PortCorp. We're going to be talking about crypto history. As a matter of fact, this is part one of cryptocurrency history. So let's get into it and learn a little bit more about the cryptocurrency space. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the next video in this series. Today, we're going to be talking about the history of crypto, and we're going to be breaking this video up into two separate videos so we can try to give you a still high-level overview of the history of crypto. Now, to help me do this, I have BC PortCorp here with me today. He's no stranger to this channel, but I appreciate the fact that he's taken time out of his day to come here and talk to us about crypto history, because this man is all over this stuff. Links to his channel and all of his information are in the description of this video. Make sure you're following him and showing him a little bit of love over on his side of things. BC, welcome. Appreciate you being here today.
I'm glad to be here. This is one of my favorite topics, and it's kind of interesting to have been here so long and really see the whole kind of change that you wanted to touch on from the beginning to our current stage of things. And you can kind of see once we get to like the end of the video, price action is kind of teasing where we might go when we talk about the end of the video. Alt season has definitely been changing, and
yeah, that's true.
Hopefully we continue to see the change going forward and it be more of a positive change. Some of those things that we all complain about in crypto kind of like take a step back, Degenning is fun, but like we'll just kind of have to break it on.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we're going to hash that out as we start diving into things here. This first video is going to focus a lot on Bitcoin in particular, because I mean, it's the oldest, it's the original, it's the one that's getting the most adoption right now. And no matter where you decide you want to plant your flag in the crypto space, because again, you can do whatever you want basically in this space. That's the idea, or at least it's supposed to be. So, but it makes sense to understand where it all began and some of the terms and way that Bitcoin operates will be instrumental in understanding the other things we're going to be talking about a little later on. I guess we'll start there. Let's I'll kick it off, and then we're going to let BC kind of jump in here. So Bitcoin started out 2008. At this point in time, as of the recording of this video, it's like not all that long ago, but it has come a very long way in that short span of time. It was originally created by Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody knows who that Satoshi Nakamoto is, and he started mining Bitcoin in 2009. Now, we were in the heart, the absolute middle of a financial crisis, now known as the 2008 financial crisis, and Bitcoin was created as an answer to that. BC, why don't you take us a little bit deeper into where that all started?
So, I mean, it was a direct response to your traditional means of banking as to why Bitcoin even came around. And if you look back on that first block, there's actually a hidden message written on that block. And it's the Times 03 January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. And that's the first message on the first block of Bitcoin. And so this whole message kind of steers us into the direction of why Bitcoin was even created. It was created as a means to debank yourself from a traditional means that we've clearly see doesn't work. We've watched it fail time and time and time again throughout history. Once you kind of get to a certain breaking point and your governments start to play around with their money, like Rome shaving off pieces of gold on their currencies to kind of deflate things so that they can print more currency. That's kind of the times that we're in now. And instead of using gold, we use paper money, which is way easier to manipulate. And
Yes,
so
indeed.
as a way to have an unmanipulated currency that everyone can, instead of trust in, have a trustless system, because you dive into and you can see, well, it's like, okay, this wallet received this much Bitcoin because they mined the block reward, and then this Bitcoin was sold to this person. You don't have to trust anything. Go and look. It's a trustless system that proves it's trustful because everyone has the incentive to be trustful.
Exactly. And it re-evaluates itself and that trust approximately every 10 minutes since its inception.
You can go back all the way. I run a node, so I can go back and I can look at every single block and see every transaction that was patched in that block, that was sent, what those address wallets, what the wallet addresses were. And it proves itself. And you can go back to its inception in 2009 and see that first block and see all of the transactions since then.
Yes. Now, for most people who are probably watching this video, who are just getting into cryptocurrency and trying to wrap their head around things, they don't and have not had the need or the reason or even the ability, for that matter, to operate outside of a trust-based system where you need a trusted third party to facilitate these transactions. Given that, let's dive in a little bit to why this trustless piece is so important. I at the end of the day, much like you mentioned, all the way back to Rome, where they're clipping the coins and so on and so forth, these entities, these trusted third parties, at the end of the day, can't be trusted. And we found that numerous times, and if you look in life, you see that all over the place. How do you think we transition from a trusted, needing that third party, to a trustless, when you almost feel in your innards here that you've got to have some kind of trust? How do you trust the code versus a person? Any thoughts on that?
Well, okay. So it comes down to the fact of, do you trust a person who is fallible, who even at the end of the day could have the fullest intentions and just clicks the wrong button and a mistake is made? Or you trust a code that is immutable, has proven itself over and over and over again to facilitate these transactions? And so as you go forward in technology's progression, we have gotten to a point where to move money around, you no longer need a third party to transfer vast amounts of gold in exchange to these debt notes, which is fiat currency. So it used to be, okay, well, I pay with this debt note, which is fiat, which is immediately tied to gold. And now the bank's balance is out of whack with someone else's. Hey, we actually owe you this much gold. So now we have to figure out a way how to move said amount of gold from here to here. That's what third parties were for. You don't
Yes.
need that. You can now transact with your everyday man over the internet extremely easily. And the crazy part of that is, even if the internet goes down for just a little while, your Bitcoin is still there. If the internet starts back up, Bitcoin continues as it was. You could also do off-chain transactions and transact that way with Bitcoin. So you don't necessarily need the blockchain running as that proof of all of this going forward. So
That's a
even if
good point.
and
That's a good
that's a
point.
big part of that, is like, you don't, if everything collapses, you don't need that third party to come back in and facilitate these transactions. It is immutable. You can do this on chain, off chain, as long as it moves, then you're fine.
Exactly. Okay, excellent. Now, I can already hear some people that are watching this in the background going, yeah, so what? Yeah, kind of thing. But okay, let's try and answer the so what. How does Bitcoin create that immutability and create that trustless nature? Maybe we break that down a little bit for everybody, so hopefully they understand it.
So, like, a lot of that has to do with the decentralized aspects
Yes.
of Bitcoin. Instead of everything being centralized like it is in your government fiat systems, where you have a centralized bank that is in control of the printing of money. It is a decentralized system that is in control of printing the money. You have now mining groups, but it was originally solo miners, where this person would initially mine a Bitcoin, which every time he got a block, he would receive 50 Bitcoin. And then after a 4-year cycle where you have the set amount of blocks that has been achieved, the mining rewards decrease. And this keeps the blockchain going and makes the incentive a little more, incentivizes you to do it in a more efficient way to get this Bitcoin, as opposed to the current system that we have, where the incentive is to act maliciously to get more money and act less efficiently to get more money. And this is it is a direct counter opposition to your current financial system. And that's what's so beautiful about it. You don't have to trust anyone. You just have to see what's been happening and kind of understand at a base level. You don't even need a super deep dive into Bitcoin to really
Yeah, you don't
understand.
need to be a coder.
Hmm.
You don't need to be a coder. And you know what? You bring up a good point, because you, me, anybody watching this video can be part of that network, can be part of the earning process, can be part of the validation process. And we probably, I know we're kind of talking in higher aspects right now, but for those who don't understand, basically Bitcoin mining takes these days things called ASICs, and you use those powerful machines. They take a lot of energy, and they solve cryptographic puzzles, and it is about the best way to put that, in order to solve the block, which is what BC was just saying, and be able to get the reward, because there's an incentive reward for each of those blocks currently, as of the recording of this video, which will eventually evaporate. And what, 140 years from now, if my memory
Yeah,
serves.
after we're all long dead.
Yeah, we'll be dust at that point. Exactly. But there's also transaction fees, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we're not trying to dive too deeply, but we want to give you an understanding that you can be part of this mining process, which helps to secure the network, also helps to give you the opportunity to earn Bitcoin. And that in and of itself provides that trustless nature. Now, there are also things called nodes, and I'm not trying to jump around too much here. The nodes will provide you the opportunity, like BC was saying earlier, he can go all the way back to verify transactions, all the way back to the first block that was ever mined. Anything else you want to add in with regard to the mining and the nodes there, BC?
So, like, the whole mining and node process, where you have a miner that he batches a group of transactions together into a 1 megabyte block, so that's why Bitcoin moves slow.
Yes.
And yes, it does cost a little bit of money because it moves slower, but it keeps things moving at a steady pace, and it keeps it being facilitated in that steady, forever moving forward, and gives it that security that we all like. And it also helps it hold its value incredibly well. Whereas if you compare it to gold, gold is extremely tough to move around, and it moves extremely slow. And this is why Bitcoin is so resilient. And at the other end of it, you have your node. So once a block is made by a miner and they receive their reward and it gets attached to that blockchain, The nodes all receive that new update of that blockchain, and it is sent out to everyone. So instead of trusting one person, you can now trust all of the nodes that just received that new block. And we have all validated it. And then we all receive the next block and we all validate that and we all add that to the blockchain so that everyone can see that going forward. It's very, very, very trustless because you don't trust one person. You trust thousands of people instead of trusting one entity.
Yes, anywhere across the globe. Anywhere across the globe, which is the great piece. Now, I know we're throwing out some terms right now, things like blockchain, and you might be like, okay, I've heard it. I'm not quite familiar with it. That's going to be a little bit beyond the scope of this particular video, because again, this is more about the history of cryptocurrency. But watch for future videos in this series, and we're going to be talking specifically, get a little more specific about what a blockchain is, etc. However, we also need to talk about what the algorithm is, the consensus algorithm is a little bit, so you understand. Bitcoin is a proof of work algorithm, basically utilizing those miners to create the consensus, to have everyone be able to verify these transactions. One other thing that I think is important, we've kind of hinted around about it here a little bit, is that Bitcoin has a finite supply that is listed in the code. There will never be the ability to create more than 21 million. And I think that is where, to the points that BC was making earlier, the places like Rome, and even currently we see here in the US trying to inflate away these other currencies, the ability to do that is not really accessible in Bitcoin because the code prevents it. Now, you say, well, maybe somebody could alter the code. That is true. But when you see the video that we have on blockchain, you'll understand, and we're going to touch on it briefly in a little while, that would create something called a fork in the chain. And that would mean that the validators, the nodes, you and I, if you are part of that system, would be able to say, no, we don't want what they just did. We're going to keep this, and that will be Bitcoin. Okay. BC, anything else you want to add to that? I just wanted to make sure we touched on those points before we move on.
Well, so the whole fixed supply, it is a fixed supply unless voted to change that, which then again leads to that whole forking situation that you talked about. If you don't have the majority who agree that the supply of Bitcoin should be 21 million, and they say it should be, let's go 42 million. So double the supply. And if you don't have a majority of those people agreeing with that, and you have a smaller majority that thinks 42 million sounds like a great cap on that supply.
Sure, that's not bad. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they're allowed to split off, use that same Bitcoin, the same Bitcoin code, and the only thing that is now changed is that set supply. So from there, you now have all of those backdated transactions, and you will see if that Bitcoin flourishes. They normally rename it so that you don't get confused. That's where you see like a Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV,
and we're going to talk a little bit about those in a minute. Yes. Yeah.
And so that's where you will see these split offs, and instead it won't be Bitcoin. It'll be whatever this new version of Bitcoin is. So that's where you will always have that 21 million set supply on this original Bitcoin. You are allowed to change things, but then that no longer becomes Bitcoin. It becomes a new version of Bitcoin.
Correct. And we probably should also mention, if you're just getting into the crypto space, you might have even already heard the term digital gold, which is used to refer to Bitcoin in a lot of cases, even from governments. And as of the recording of this video, I mean, we have El Salvador that's already created Bitcoin as legal tender, but there are a number of other countries across the globe who either are mining Bitcoin, who are stacking Bitcoin, buying Bitcoin. It is increasing all the time because of this digital gold concept and the limited supply of 21 million. Now, we probably should highlight, BC, and I'll let you highlight it. You've mentioned that, Bitcoin can be slow. and it can be like expensive to utilize that base chain. But there have been some improvements we've seen during the course of Bitcoin's life that have tried to help to fix that a little bit and eliminate that a little bit. Why don't you touch on those real quick, just so everybody that's watching has an idea?
I'm sure a lot of the people that have been around have probably heard of the Lightning Network. So in 2017, you had your miners and who got to vote. Do we approve this new code that's going to be added to the blockchain, which was called SegWit? And this allowed for improved efficiency by enabling a second layer to interact with that Bitcoin blockchain, which allowed for a scaling solution and off-chain transactions to be done through the Lightning Network. So instead of having 1,000 list of Bitcoin transactions that these miners now have to validate, it gets batched in. And so this second chain batches that, and then they send that batch over to your initial chain, which just basically adds it to the blockchain. So it kind of frees up a bit of space. And you saw El Salvador really take advantage of that when they said that, hey, we're going to have Bitcoin as legal tender. And then back in 2021, you had a new Taproot update to the blockchain, which was also heavily debated among miners and nodes. And say a node doesn't approve this new update, then they are allowed to go with the miners that also don't approve that new update. And that's where you see those forks. But Taproot was widely approved, and it increased the privacy, and it also added the capability of doing smart contracts. Hasn't been a whole lot done with that. You do see things like runes being added onto Bitcoin, but that's more of a topic for later in the video.
Yeah, that's another topic, and smart contracts, again, another phrase you'll hear here in the space, and it is going to be a video for a later time. So I will link that back in the notes and probably up in the corner here once that video is created, and that way you can go ahead and learn more about smart contracts. But let's kind of bring this together, BC, and highlight some of the positives and negatives, because again, I think it's something that, you know, this is a new concept to a lot of people, and this whole new banking system concept, because at the end of the day, that's kind of what this is. We've created a new banking system that you are the bank. You and I are the bank. We don't need to go to a physical building or even on our phone and our app in order to transact with people. Thank you to Bitcoin. So what are some of the positives that you think, the key positives for Bitcoin in particular?
So, of course, there's the decentralization aspect, which is the key grab to Bitcoin. If you are a fan of decentralization, you don't like any single entity that has too much power or sway in your money, then Bitcoin's a great place to go. Everyone that's heard of Bitcoin has probably heard of, if not Michael Saylor, at least Strategy, who has been all over the news talking about Bitcoin and buying Bitcoin and continuously buying more Bitcoin. He didn't care if it was the top. He was buying when we were back at 74K, and everyone's like, well, what if it doesn't? He's like, I don't care. I'm not looking at selling now. I'm never looking at selling. So this is always a good time to buy if you're never looking at selling. But even he owns just 1%, and he owns billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. So very, very, very decentralized in both its supply and its creation process. You have that censorship resistance, whereas like once that block has been made, can't be changed. It's done. It's immutable. You'd have to go back and change thousands and thousands and thousands of nodes, which are currently running. And I believe that that number is somewhere up in that 78,000 mark. So you'd have to go back and change 78,000 different people's recording of the blockchain. Impossible. You're not doing it. There's no way to.
You're right. The likelihood of doing that is very low, very low.
which also touches on that security aspect, where the Bitcoin is extremely secure because instead of just changing one or 1 0, you'd have to change thousands of ones and thousands of zeros, not at one time, not just, okay, well, we got this one and you'd have to change them all at the same time.
And I think this
Impossible
is,
to do.
I agree. But I for one second, I think we should deviate for 1 second, because I think this is a good point to talk about the fact that while there, things, it seems like this will be a private way to transact. It's really not ultra private to use Bitcoin. So you hear it. If you do some research, you'll hear that stupid criminals are using Bitcoin because you can track everything. And again, this is something we'll get into in the video where we're talking more specifically about the blockchain. However, in a high level overview, the Bitcoin blockchain is completely visible to anybody, anywhere, at any time. The only thing that gives you any kind of anonymity with your Bitcoin is if people don't know that a specific Bitcoin address is related to you. And then you have a little bit of anonymity. But remember that they can still track your address and where the Bitcoin goes. So it was built that way by design. Now, another note, not every blockchain is built this way, but it's important to note that, for blockchains like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, having this kind of ability to be able to audit the blockchain is another reason why you don't need permission. You don't have to believe the check is in the mail, because you can go and verify that the money's on its way. Anything else you want to add to that, BC? I just thought this was a good point to throw that in there so everybody understands a little better.
Oh, most definitely. So as you were saying, it's not anonymous. The name that was tied to that is pseudo-anonymous. So there still are completely private transactions, like the Mr. 100 who buys 100
Yep.
Bitcoin in every single batch. No one knows who that is, but no one knows who that is because said person has not come forward and been like, I'm Mr. 100. Like,
Right.
he hasn't come forward and said that. So there is the possibility of anonymity, but you have to take those steps to be completely anonymous.
Correct.
The government has kind of come in there and made it a little bit harder and harder to be completely anonymous on the blockchain, but you can be if you take the proper steps. So
Agreed. So everybody understands that, and again, there'll be another video also with regard to security in this series. Like, again, it's recorded. I will make sure it's in the description and up in the corner here, so you'll be able to bounce around as you need to understand these concepts a little bit better. Speaking of security, BC, did you want to hit the next positive point there with regard to Bitcoin?
Oh yeah, so the scarcity and inflation resistance, which is all built in at the same point, and that's going to be the limited supply. The limited supply and the way that new supply is introduced into the market. That is an amazing process, which kind of you saw in the mining of gold. As it gets tougher and tougher to mine gold and the cost to mine that gold gets more and more expensive, that also goes into that price of gold, which kind of negates that inflation part of the money. Bitcoin does the exact same thing. As it gets harder and harder to mine a Bitcoin, the price to mine that Bitcoin increases, which also keeps it from inflating like crazy. And that set supply is that other aspect of that. There can only be 21 million. And so once you break it down, it is infinitely divisible. Right now, we have sats, which are 1/1000th of a Bitcoin. Eventually, it won't be sats. It'll be broken down even further because of the fact that one Bitcoin or 1/1000th of a Bitcoin is just too big of a number to transact with.
Right. That's a crazy concept for a lot of people who are probably watching this video to even wrap their head around. And I'm hoping that as history moves forward, we're able to come back and make another video referencing this and be like, okay, so here we are now. That will be a very exciting video.
Oh yeah. I mean, it kind of I don't know how many people know the whole Keynesian economics versus Austrian economics debate, but it kind of proves that whole Austrian economics theory, which any set supply of money is enough to run any size economy because it is infinitely divisible. So instead of, say, if the US wasn't getting rid of the penny, and instead they were adding something even smaller than the penny,
Yes,
instead of inflating your currency, you now break it down further. It holds its value. You just transact at an incrementally smaller level.
level, right,
Yeah.
right.
And that's what Bitcoin does. Instead of being like, oh, well, because our economy is bigger, we now need more dollars in the system. No, just break it down further. Have that initial thing hold its value and just break those pieces into smaller pieces. If you
That's
don't,
the important piece, having it
Mhm,
hold its value. Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just transacting with basically toilet paper.
Good analogy right there. Listen,
Oh,
I think there's one more positive point you want to hit on that before we talk about, because with everything that's positive, there's always negatives.
oh.
And you want to hit that last point?
Well, permissionless and borderless. No one needs to give you permission to enter the Bitcoin system. You can do
Amen.
it all by yourself, and there's no one that can tell you, actually, you're not a part of this economy. If you want in, you purchase your Bitcoin and then you transact with your Bitcoin, or you hold it, or you do whatever said purpose that you want with your Bitcoin. And there's also no barriers to that. There's no Swift system that tells you, actually, sir,
Yes.
you can't buy these goods from said country because we have an embargo with them. If you want your goods from Saudi Arabia, you buy them from Saudi Arabia and you just send it over there, and no one's interfering with that process. So it's very open and opens the world up to more transactions that cannot be stopped. It kind of negates it, it does open up the door to some governmental security issues, as you've seen in the past. They're like, oh, well, criminals use Bitcoin to transact. Well, it's like, how do you know that? Oh, because you could watch it. Oh, you watched that Bitcoin get sent from this dubious entity and received by this other dubious entity in another country, and you were able to track that, and you know who did it. Wow, that sounds like a very, very inefficient way. That sounds like a super efficient way for criminals to interact with each other. The
Yeah.
real criminals use paper. If you really
Yes.
want to stay anonymous, you send paper money from one place to another, and no one knows what happened.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. So many avenues to go down there, but again, a little bit beyond the scope of this particular video. Maybe, I don't know, BC, maybe we're going to make another video about that, but
I do. We might have to. We might have to go into a whole deep rabbit hole.
oh, and it would be a rabbit hole, that's for sure. All right, but let's keep this video moving here a little bit, and let's talk about some of the negatives. Obviously, as you mentioned earlier, there are some scalability issues. The transaction fees when things are really busy on the blockchain can get like super high. We've seen that, and also, as much as Bitcoin on average runs a block approximately every 10 minutes, during those peak times of congestion, things can slow down on that blockchain a little bit. So it then incentivizes people who are using or attempting to use the blockchain to pay higher fees to make sure that their transactions get pulled ahead of everyone else's, which, hey, I'm good with, like, capitalism and all that kind of stuff. But again, it's a negative if you are a small person who's just barely stacking sats, who is doing a dollar cost averaging scenario, much like we alluded to earlier in a couple of pieces of our conversation. If you're just trying to, get that to be able to transact in this new economy. One of the other things is energy consumption. Now, again, remember I mentioned earlier that we use these processors called ASICs, and they are energy intensive. And so the electricity to, even if you're using what BC mentioned, like a pool to mine Bitcoin, becomes very energy intensive. I am encouraged by the fact, and BC, I'm going to ask you to chime in on this in a second, that we have found, because one of the, we're talking history, let's go back a little bit. When Bitcoin first came out, one of the biggest negatives, biggest pieces of FUD that got thrown out about Bitcoin is that it was going to boil the oceans. It was going to use so much energy. It used more energy than countries and this, that, and as it expands, it's only going to get worse. We've seen exactly the opposite of that. One, I mean, the equipment has gotten more efficient. So, I mean, that's just a given. But we have been able to utilize, and I say we as the Bitcoin space, have been able to utilize renewable sources of energy in so many locations across the globe. And it's been able to take that energy consumption and focus it in a very unique way, such as they can actually take it from place to place. So you don't have to set a single facility and then be stuck there. You can help facilitate growth. And this is where I want BC to chime in, facilitate growth of economies by utilizing Bitcoin mining to help do that. BC, you want to talk about a couple of those things?
So you've had places that are kind of remote that have hydropower, who have
Yes.
used their hydropower to mine Bitcoin and then sell off that Bitcoin. So it's basically them selling energy. Bitcoin, just like a lot of other currencies, is a transfer of energy. It just depends on how you're transferring that energy along. This is a direct transfer of energy. You've also had places like in New York where you have mining operations that use the heat off of their miners to have greenhouses.
Yes.
So not
Yes.
only are they mining Bitcoin, but they're also producing food with these machines that are mining this Bitcoin. You also had right after that whole giant, oh, well, Bitcoin will boil the oceans and it'll use so much energy. You had oil companies who are now taking what would normally just be the leftover byproducts of their energy production and using that to mine Bitcoin.
Yes.
So as we progress further, just like all other technologies, the way to mine Bitcoin has been getting more and more efficient. And that's part of the incentivization process of Bitcoin. And it doesn't stay stagnant. You don't use a computer that you have 6 GPUs chained up in that uses a 1500 watts per kilowatt hour. Like, that's not how it goes anymore.
Yes.
That person cannot mine Bitcoin at a cost-effective way. And so they leave the system or they find a new way to do it. So just
Yes.
like
More
every other,
efficiently.
yeah. And just like every other system, we get more and more and more efficient. That next part that has kind of been teased, I know we talked about it in one of your shows, was nuclear. And we'll kind of
Yes.
have to see how that plays out because you've already had places like New Hampshire and I believe Saudi Arabia as well has also talked about mining Bitcoin with nuclear power. So we're not a
Yeah.
very big nuclear country. We only have a very small amount of electricity that is produced by nuclear power, but these places that do have nuclear power can mine Bitcoin way more efficiently than
Yeah.
your average solo miner.
Yep, I agree. There's one other piece of this efficiency that I'd like to touch on. And for those of us that live in the United States, we've seen it firsthand. Our grid, if you are one of these conspiracy theory type of people, they'll tell you our energy grid is so fragile and so on and so forth. And okay, again, video for a different time. They're not necessarily wrong. However, we've seen Bitcoin miners used to help solidify that infrastructure in Texas, for example, where their grid went down due to a storm. Bitcoin miners pull off their load, and guess what? The people, the hospitals, whoever needed that energy was able to get the energy because the Bitcoin miners took a step back. And then once everything was squared away, what do? They fire up the miners again, and then everything's back to status quo. I think that efficient use of energy is something that not enough people understand about Bitcoin, especially when it comes to these people who are still throwing out the, oh my God, it's going to boil the oceans. Anything else you want to add to that? To me, that was something that definitely is so unique with regard to Bitcoin miners.
Well, it goes into that cost-effective thing. If it's not cost-effective to use your allotted power at that time because it has now gotten incredibly more expensive because something's going on, they're going to take their miners off. And well, it's not cost-efficient right now. And then the energy gets used by the people that actually need to use it and can afford to pay that. That I could dive into the whole rabbit hole of your electricity grids not being what they should be, and that all has to do with money. So we'll just leave that where it is.
Again, I don't know. I'm gonna have to start taking notes, BC. I think we got more videos coming.
Oh yeah. Well, people don't realize, but there's a lot of money made off of electricity. And that's why there's not an incentive to fix the power grids, because there's a lot of money made when it's like, oh, well, this area needs electricity. Well, guess what? We have tons of electricity. So instead of you being super efficient, we're just going to charge you money to move this electricity over here. And then they shuffle it right back later when it's a whole money thing.
It is literally a money scam. And it's so crazy that that's even allowed. But again, we're going to get down a bad rabbit hole right here, BC. We need to.
Oh yeah.
We'll be back, folks. We'll be back to that.
Oh yeah, you want to talk about Enron?
Yep. Maybe that's a live stream. Okay, watch for that, folks. All right. The other piece, I think this is kind of poignant right now, is the volatility in the price of Bitcoin. That can be a negative, especially when you're trying to do something like, as of the recording of this video, has recently been announced with like a strategic Bitcoin reserve with the United States, and for these other countries who, like El Salvador, we mentioned earlier, who utilizes Bitcoin as legal tender, and even if you're these other countries that are mining Bitcoin, etc. The volatility in the actual price action can be a negative. And as much as that's the case, I would argue to you that it's not as big a negative as many people would make it out to be if you have the right time horizon in your mind. Because yes, in the short term, it can be extremely volatile. As you get into the space, you may see Bitcoin going $5,000, $10,000 up or down in any given 1 hour period. But beyond that, if you're trading, that's great. But if you're actually doing, like we were talking about earlier, possibly just pulling some sats aside, taking some Bitcoin dollar cost averaging into this asset and holding it for when you actually need it, it will end up being a great store of value over the long term. BC, anything you want to add to that?
Just look at a weekly chart, and then that sometimes you just got to zoom it on out, take a look at the weekly chart. The weekly chart shows solid growth. Yes, the growth is slowing, but that's kind of what you want. It starts to get more stable. The jumps up to the top side are not as extreme, but also with the jumps to the top side not being as extreme, the drops to the bottom side are no longer as extreme either. And we've witnessed that in this cycle. Instead of a 60% drop like we saw last cycle, it's a 30% drop, and people are flapping their pants over it, where I'm like, hey, look, that's a positive. We are showing maturity.
Exactly. And that you just hit the nail on the head. that particular asset, this particular asset, Bitcoin, is maturing. And you're right, that lack of volatility, because who really wants to utilize a currency that today is worth utilizing, using USD as an idea, that dollar that's worth $1, and then tomorrow it's only worth 60 cents. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. You need that stability in your asset to be able to transact. It's that simple. But just to wrap up a couple of other points that people might be concerned about. Regulatory pressures. Now, I think personally, the pressures on the regulatory side of things have assuaded a little bit. They've kind of gone away a little bit, and I say a little bit because they're still there, depending on where you are around the globe. But I think that given the bigger adoption we're seeing with Bitcoin, I think that we will see less regulatory pressure and hopefully more good framework for people to be able to utilize this asset class, and thinking about things like taxes, so on and so forth. So we're still going to see it. They're developing as we speak. It's not like we can give you set information as to this is what the regulations are in your country. We are not going to be able to do that. I encourage you to do your own research and find out what regulations exist in your own country, but they're probably still developing. BC, anything you want to add to that?
Not a whole lot. I think the regulation that you're going to see is less on Bitcoin and more on the rest of that crypto space.
I
As
agree.
currently, that's the nod that we've seen from our current government. Whereas in Bitcoin itself, at the end of the day, you can't really regulate Bitcoin. The only thing you can really regulate is the centralized exchanges that sell you the Bitcoin. And
Correct.
that's a big part of that process of getting your Bitcoin. Where do you get it? And we'll dive into that
We're
one.
gonna talk about that
Second.
in part
Oh,
2
yeah.
of this series. So, all right. And last but not least, there are always barriers to adoption, and one of the biggest ones I see, again, I say it all the time on my channel. Old guy, interwebs. I don't know nothing, man. Don't listen to what I got to say. I'm just an old guy. But given that I am older, I also represent a class or a group of people who are not necessarily the most technologically savvy people. So to be able to utilize a cryptocurrency wallet at our current level of development and technology might be a little bit difficult and will require a bit of a learning curve. So some people aren't going to want to take the time to learn. I get it. But again, I'm going to encourage you, do your own research, get the education you need. That's the purpose of this series that I'm putting out right now. So make sure that you try to learn about this, because eventually I think it will be to your benefit. Any other adoption barriers you might want to throw out there, BC?
I think they're kind of assuading a lot of the adoption barriers, as you've seen. Well, I'm sure some people have seen, they're now coming out with like tap pays with Bitcoin, where you
Yes.
have a ring and it holds your Bitcoin on it and you transact with it and things like that. So like it is becoming easier to use, as in before you had to download the Bitcoin node and that gave you your little Bitcoin wallet and you set up your password and all of that. It has gotten a lot easier to
Yes.
get into Bitcoin, especially with centralized exchanges and decentralized exchanges. All of these places have made it a little bit easier to get into Bitcoin than it used to be. And we'll dive into that one
Yeah,
here
we're
in a
going to get
little.
into that shortly. Folks, the bottom line is Bitcoin and the Bitcoin space was meant to help make you the bank. So you don't need a trusted third party. That was the ethos of this space from its inception. Now, much like you'll see us talking about in the next video, we think that to some degree that ethos is kind of gone by the wayside, but hopefully we'll be able to bring that back. But before we go to that video, that second video, we're going to take a quick look at some other stuff you probably need to know. We mentioned earlier stuff like forks in the blockchain. And I think it's going to be a good time now to maybe talk a little bit about this. There are also some other cryptos out there, some forked from Bitcoin, like BC mentioned earlier. You know, they can take the code and up until this point, everything's the same. And then boom, they've done something different to it, whether it's changed the supply or changed the size of the block or done something to change it. And now it's its own entity. We should touch on that a little bit. BC, do you want to jump us into that, and we'll run through it really quick and wrap this particular video up after that?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So you had the whole battle of Bitcoin back in 2011 on a lot of these forums. You had discussions going on, and it took some time to kind of see what issues might arise with Bitcoin's current system, with slower blocks at 10 minutes a block to mine 1 megabyte. Extremely slow, even at that current standard. And this is where back in 2011, you had Litecoin being the first alternative to Bitcoin. And Litecoin was not an official fork of Bitcoin because they created their own system. It was
Yes.
a slightly different hashing algorithm that they used, which made it a little more efficient to be mined with just about any device that has a CPU. It also made these block times a whole lot faster. So if you wanted a peer-to-peer transact, you could do it a lot more quickly. And that was that first soft fork from Bitcoin. You didn't give them your Bitcoin and then they sell your Bitcoin and then give you whatever Litecoin in a direct one-to-one correlation. It was a soft fork. So they created a whole new blockchain. Back in 2017, you saw your real first Bitcoin hard fork. You did
Yes.
have some before this. It's notable, but not very notable in today's time because they didn't hold up very well. But you had Bitcoin Cash, which was the first real hard fork from Bitcoin that has done really, really stuck around. It split off because they wanted to be able to transact at a higher speed. So instead of decreasing the amount of time it needs to create a new block. Instead, they made the block bigger. This was an 8 megabyte block that they decided to go with. And so it allows you to put more information on this block. More transactions are being batched to create that block. They went with 8 megabytes and then later changed it to 32. And so at the time of the split, you gave them 1 Bitcoin, they gave you 1 Bitcoin Cash. And that was that first hard fork. And all of the everything previous to that fork on that Bitcoin Cash blockchain is all Bitcoin transactions. So it
Yes.
uses the same technology. The only difference is that one little change that they decided to go with. And this was voted on. A group of miners and a group of nodes were like, hey, we like your idea better. We're going to adopt it. And a group of miners and a group of nodes were like, we don't really like
Yeah.
that.
We don't
We're
want
going
nothing
to
to
stick
do with
with,
that. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's like we like the original message, and so they stuck with Bitcoin, and that's why you see that first real major split in Bitcoin. You
It
have
should
had
be
others since then, but that's the
right.
first real notable one.
And to that point, that's what I was just about to say is it should be noted that that was very contentious at the time. There was a lot of upheaval in the space with regard to that. As you continue with learning more about crypto, you'll hear reference sometimes to the block size wars, and that's what they're referring to, is that particular hard fork that took place. And whether you like it, don't like it, that kind of stuff can happen. And I think, as BC very eloquently explained, shows you how a fork in a chain can not only create a separate cryptocurrency, but it can show you how you can make whatever changes you want. I mean, in theory, anybody could go in, fork the Bitcoin blockchain and make their own cryptocurrency. It's what it is. It's open source technology. But again, will anybody want to use the Keith coin? I don't know. I doubt it very highly. I doubt it very highly. All right, BC, keep her going. Take us down the rest of the road here.
So, and then the next real alternative to Bitcoin on that whole road would have been Ripple and XRP in 2012, created by Judd Caleb, Arthur Brito, and David Schwartz under OpenCoin, which was later purchased by Ripple Labs. And unlike Bitcoin, XRP uses a consensus algorithm rather than proof of work. And I'm sure you'll probably dive into that when you do your whole blockchain video, because it's slightly different than your normal blockchain. Whereas instead of everything being mined, it is all pre-mined and then released to the public. So a very new concept to the whole crypto space. And then your next real notable one would be Ethereum. If you've heard of Bitcoin, you've probably heard of Ethereum. Yeah. And that was number 2, queen of crypto, and created by Vitalik Buterin in 2015, and a team that included Gavin Wood and Joseph Lubin introduced smart contracts. And as you said earlier, you will have a whole video on that. And that's the real difference between Ethereum and Bitcoin. Ethereum originally used a proof of work or mining algorithm to create Ethereum. The only problem that Vitalik Buterin had with Bitcoin is that he didn't think it was actually applicable to all of the uses in your daily life. And he wanted to add smart contracts onto a blockchain. And that's why Ethereum became that real number 2 in crypto. It added something else to the crypto space. And that's where you'll dive on into that one. But that smart contracts really pushed things forward. It allowed for a lot more use cases than just transacting with your peer-to-peer, as the Bitcoin white paper initially put out.
We're about to go into the last piece where we're going to talk about layer 1s and layer 2 solutions. And that in and of itself, and again, there's going to be an entire video on crypto and blockchain terms, because let me tell you, there are so many acronyms and terms in this space, it can make your head spin. So watch for that video when it comes out. Again, I'll link it once it is created. But quick idea about layer 1s. Basically, think about that as the base. It's the very bottom. It is where all of the protocol information is located. It is the railroad tracks where everything runs on. That's layer 1s. Layer 2 would be the train running on top of that track. It's the stuff that's built on top of that particular blockchain that does, who knows, various things depending on what they're meant to be doing. Do you want to highlight a couple of those, BC, or add to any of my description, by the way?
No, I think you hit on that pretty nicely. Most of those big alts that you hear are going to be layer 1s. And so the space is opening up quite a bit for now. What are you going to build on top of your big layer 1s? You've kind of had your layer 1 battle. It's still kind of going on just a little bit.
It is, yeah.
As to who's going to be number 2, who's going to be number 3, who's going to be number 4. And as the dust kind of settles, they'll kind of fill their niches in the crypto space. It's like, hey, we're going to be with voting, like Cardano has said that it potentially wants to do at a governmental level. These other layer 1s will now need layer 2s on top of them to actually utilize that layer 1's capabilities. So you hit on the description quite well.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And there's a number of them out there. Again, as the recording of this video, there's so many. But There just is. And we could highlight a few, but you know, depending on when you're watching this video, it may not even be relevant at that point. So we're gonna pretty much bypass that. Okay, that's gonna wrap up this part 1 of the history of Bitcoin and the history of the crypto space. Stay tuned. Part 2 is coming up next, and we're going to take you through a lot of the ethos, or what was supposed to be the original ethos of the space. We're going to talk about how you can get into the space and how that's changed over time, and to where we think you're going to be going in the future. BC, thank you for being here for this first part of this video. I appreciate it, and we'll see you on the second part, all right?
I'm glad to be here. I will see you all there.
All right. All right. I hope you found that video helpful. Make sure that you check out any links we talked about that are in the description of this video. And stay tuned for the next video in this series, which is going to be part 2 of cryptocurrency history. And once it's recorded and posted, it'll be right here. So head on over and I will see you there.